Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Today we're continuing what we talked about in the last video regarding the religious sphere, and the next couple of videos I'm just gonna keep going over this different points related to the religious sphere of existence, just because it was so important to Kierkegaard. I mean, it's like I said way back at the very beginning. There was a quote I gave. I forget exactly what it was, but I thought it captured Kierkegaard's philosophy, and it all centers on religion and Christianity in particular. And so obviously this religious sphere is going to be where a lot of Kierkegaard's focus is headed. But again, much of that, I still think there's value in it, even though it's ostensibly religious. There's still a lot we can take from it, even if we drop the religious, the explicitly religious kind of connotations. We can still get some really useful nuggets, existential nuggets from this. So anyway, let's get to the diagram. And so the area we're looking at today is in the, as I said, the religious sphere. We're going to be looking at faith and the absolute and relative telos. And down the bottom, actually, you can see the religiousness A and B, and that's connected to the pathetic dialectic. And that's probably the most important part of this, of the religious. But before we get to that, I just want to cover some of these other points and just give a kind of, just clear the path before we get to to discussing the religious sphere itself in the detail that we're going to. And there are some terms that we need to be familiar with, and some ideas that we just need to be acquainted with before we go that far. So, with that said, let's jump straight into the first topic for the day, which is faith. Alright, so basically, I mean, faith is it's not a particularly in-depth topic. I'm just going to give you a couple of points regarding what Kierkegaard had to say about faith. And the first one is that, it's a quote actually, so that's a nice start. He says, "One can only be in faith, not once and for all, but daily acquiring the certain spirit of faith through the infinite personal passionate interest." And so the idea here, it's again connected to things that I've talked about before, but the idea is that this isn't faith is not a position that we come to hold and then we can kind of move on with our lives or go on to the next problem. It's not something we resolve once and for all. It's a position. It's not a position. It's a way of life. It's something we have to constantly work at. And that's why Kierkegaard calls it an infinite personal passionate interest. It's something that we never stop investing ourselves in. So it has that level of commitment, but it's a commitment that never finishes, that never comes to an end. And that's just because you are an existing human being, right? So the task set for you here can never be complete as long as you are existing, as long as you yourself are incomplete. And interesting, just there's another link here to Sartre. Sartre, in Being in Nothingness, has a similar idea when he talks about the gambler who makes his resolution once and for all: I'm going to stop gambling, that's it, I'm done, only to be confronted with that very same decision, that very same choice the next time he walks past a casino. So the idea is that as a human subject, as an existing individual, any decision you make is never complete. It's never final. It's never resolved once and for all. You always have to continually make these decisions anew. And for Sartre, that was the point. There was that's what distinguishes the for itself from the in itself. The for itself can never get that certainty. It's not quite what Kierkegaard's talking about here, but there's, you can see the connection, the link. So that was the first point. The second point is that faith is arrived at through objective uncertainty, not proof. So we're not talking about we can't come to believe something by, or say, on the strength of the evidence, right? Belief or faith for Kierkegaard is not something we can be convinced of, and it's not something that the more evidence you get, the stronger your belief, the stronger your faith. Objectively, we can never be certain. It's objective facts and evidence will never get us closer than mere approximation, remember. So faith is not something which can be arrived at through proof. It's always inherently uncertain, objectively speaking. And he says something interesting here in the postscript. He asks, what about the person who demands certainty before risking everything? What about the person who says, well, I want to believe and I'm kind of ready to, but I need more before I risk everything, before I put all of my eggs in this basket? And Kierkegaard answers that, first of all, it's only in the risky venture that one can change oneself absolutely. So it's only when there is some element of risk involved that that one stands to gain anything of value. So if you take away the risk, then you're not going to get anything meaningful at the other end. And related to that, the request itself is self-contradictory. Certainty and definitiveness belong to the present, right? But what we're talking about here, in terms of faith, is this is something which is coming. Faith for, and we'll come to this in a moment. Faith of the absolute telos, of our eternal happiness. That's what we're banking on. That's what we're putting our faith in, and that belongs to the future. So we can only relate to faith. We can only relate to that absolute telos, that absolute goal. We can only relate to that through expectation, not certainty. Expectation is, by its very nature, by what it is, necessarily uncertain. So when the person who wants certainty before investing themselves in faith, in the object of faith, is asking to do something impossible, because the object of faith is in the future, and the future is, by definition, always uncertain. And a third point is that one cannot risk everything on a certitude. If it's certain, if the person demanding this guarantee gets it, then there is no risk. The risk is gone, right? And then we're not left with a risk anymore, but we're left with an exchange. That's all we're getting. And that kind of links back to the first point I made, which is you don't get anything of value when you lose the risk. It's just a transaction. And Kierkegaard's looking at something more important, something more meaningful here than that. That's what his faith is aimed at. In the philosophical crumbs, the next point I want to make, he talks about Greek skepticism and how they doubted not by virtue of knowledge, so not by saying that they needed more knowledge, and before they could be sure, they doubted. Their skepticism was a function of will. So they withheld assent. They didn't assent to what their senses were telling them. So it was that gave them their skepticism, rather than kind of weighing the evidence, rather than looking at knowledge, what we know, what we don't know, and kind of making a calculation. It was their skepticism came from will. They willed it by withholding their assent. And the purpose here was to achieve peace of mind, right? In particular, if you think of people like the Stoics and the skeptics, obviously. And similarly for Kierkegaard, belief, or faith, which is the same thing, belief is not about knowledge either. It's a free act, an act of will. And the quote I'll give you, belief is not a type of knowledge, but a free act, an expression of will. It believes becoming and has thus in itself cancelled the uncertainty that corresponds to the nothingness of non-being. So there's a little bit in there to break down. So first of all, belief has nothing to do with knowledge, as if more knowledge could strengthen our belief or entice us to believe something and have faith in something. And he deals with becoming. And in this way, he talks about overcoming the uncertainty that's inherent in non-being or possibility. Remember that we talked about non-being and possibility, and how they kind of move to actuality through becoming. So becoming, non-being, being, those three terms are all caught up with each other. And belief is involved in this process, and it's a form of becoming which cancels that uncertainty, that the possibility that we saw was a part of non-being. So it gets us out of that uncertainty, not objectively speaking, but it gives us certitude that's not founded on any kind of objective fact or objective circumstance. So the bottom line here is that belief is a decision, not an inference. And it's a decision which ultimately eliminates doubt, eliminates uncertainty, but not through the accumulation of facts or evidence or proof. And I've got another quote which should just drill this point home. Belief is the opposite of doubt. Belief and doubt are not two different types of knowledge that can be determined in continuity with each other, because neither of them is a cognitive act. They are opposite passions. Belief is a sense for becoming, and doubt is a protest against any conclusion that goes beyond immediate sensation and immediate cognition. So basically that's saying the same thing as I've already said, but it's just coming from Kierkegaard, not me. And it's just that belief and doubt have nothing to do with knowledge. They're passions. They come from the will, and as we saw, that was how the skeptics doubted the ancient Greeks. They doubted through their will, and that's what Kierkegaard's saying faith is about as well. Faith is just the opposite. It's we believe in something through the force of will. And the last point, which is kind of a little bit abstract, but belief is therefore not concerned with essence. So it's not concerned with kind of particular details about what makes a thing what it is. Rather, it's concerned with being and therefore becoming, which we saw in that quote, 2 quotes back. And that gets us to that allows us to overcome the doubt inherent in non-being and impossibility. And so that's basically what I wanted to say about faith and belief. And so let's move on to this idea of the relative and the absolute telos. Alright, so relative and absolute telos. First of all, then let's look at what telos actually is. So telos just means a goal or an end or an aim, something we're moving towards. And so then we have the relative telos and the absolute telos. Relative, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but the relative telos is a goal or an end that's always willed for the sake of something else. So something we're always looking, we're trying to achieve or trying to get, to obtain, in order to get something else. So it's not a final goal in itself. The absolute telos obviously is that final goal. That's what we're after, and it's willed for its own sake. And essentially for Kierkegaard, the absolute telos is what he calls eternal happiness. And I think it's not much of a secret that he's talking about heaven here and the hereafter, right? That's obviously what he's talking about, and that for him is the absolute telos. It's the goal which we want just for its own sake. We're not after it to get anything else. We're not after it for any other reason. We want eternal happiness for the sake of eternal happiness. So it's the absolute telos. The absolute telos can't be a thing. It can't be another thing like any other thing, or else it would then be relative to other things. So it's not a thing, and it can't be finite, because if it's finite, then it would come to an end. So it's not much of an absolute telos in that case. So it has to be not a thing and infinite, basically, and that's what eternal happiness satisfies, both of those conditions. So that's what we have here, absolute telos. And one more point to make there regarding absolute telos is that there's nothing to gain in a finite sense. So there's no, when we're pursuing or when we're working towards our absolute telos, we're not going to satisfy any finite desires, any relative telos that we might have. And so those finite desires are going to be things like anything else, basically. Anything else that you might strive for in your life. Money, a house, things, possessions, relationships, all of these things are going to be defined as relative telos for Kierkegaard, and therefore finite. They all come to an end. They're all, most of them will be external, and with the absolute telos, so this is important actually, because this doesn't necessarily follow, but Kierkegaard says with the absolute telos, you do not get any of those finite goals. It doesn't come with them. So often people will say, if you strive for, say, happiness, then you'll get, the money will come, then you'll be satisfied. All these kind of lesser goals, the relative goals here, will come with the satisfaction of that final goal. And even with religion too, right? Some people say, as long as if you focus on your religion, then God will look after you, satisfy your not all of your desires, but you can expect to be happy, right? And Kierkegaard's saying the opposite of that. That's not going to happen. The absolute telos does not give you anything to do with your finite goals, anything to do with any relative telos. So there is a big distinction between the two. However, the absolute telos doesn't ignore the relative telos. Or, sorry, it does actually. What Kierkegaard's saying here is that we shouldn't ignore our relative telos. He's not saying forget the finite and turn to the heavenly. Rather, he says, the task that he sets us is to relate to both the absolute telos and to our relative telos. Not by mediating them, not by coming up with kind of, and so this is a shot at Hegel, not by kind of forming a synthesis and finding a way through that mediates between both of those extremes. Rather, he says we relate to both the absolute telos and our relative ends by relating absolutely to his absolute telos and relatively to the relative. The latter relation belongs to the world, the former to the individual himself. And so we've got both things going on at the same time, essentially. And that's the task that Kierkegaard is giving us if we want to achieve the task that he's laying out before us. If we want to live successfully in the religious sphere. And so one of the most important things here then is concerning the absolute telos is that we have to be directed towards this all of the time. The absolute telos, by virtue of what it is, absolute and infinite, it's not something we can do when we think about it, or every Sunday when we go to church, for instance, or when the opportunity arises to act in a certain way. Rather, we have to relate to this absolute telos. We have to keep it in the forefront of our minds all the time. If we relate to it from time to time or occasionally, then we're relating to it relatively. So relating to the absolute telos, absolutely, one of the important things in doing that is that we are constantly, continually, we constantly have that absolute telos in mind. We constantly directed towards our eternal happiness, which doesn't mean we're foregoing our relative ends, our finite ends, our worldly goals. We're still pursuing those, but we've still got our absolute telos at the same time. The two don't clash, is basically what Kierkegaard's saying here. You can do both at the same time, but it's important for the absolute telos that is always going. It's always running. You're always living religiously in that sphere. You're always engaged with your ultimate goal, which is eternal happiness. So there are two mistakes then, given that situation. There are two mistakes one can make. The first, Kierkegaard talks about happening in the Middle Ages, when things like monastic orders became popular and were kind of well subscribed. And the mistake there was going too far towards the absolute and neglecting the relative telos, your relative ends. So they overdid the absolute, becoming indifferent to the finite. And remember, that's not the task here. The task is to do both. And Kierkegaard says, when we relate to the absolute telos absolutely, we're making the absolute decision. So we've committed ourselves. We've got that passion. We've got that inwardness, and we're relating to the God idea. All those things we've talked about, but at the same time, not forgetting that one is also a finite human being, and that has to also factor into any authentic human existence. Kierkegaard doesn't use that word authentic, but I think it's appropriate. The second mistake is to go the other side, relating too much to the relative ends. And when we relate, and the way Kierkegaard puts this is, he says, relating absolutely to the relative telos is vanity, avarice, envy, and those kinds of descriptions. The quote here is, he says, "It is madness, comic seen aesthetically, that a being planned eternally uses all its power to grasp the transitory, clinging to what is inconstant, believes that it has gained everything when it has gained this nothing. For the transient is nothing when it is past, and its essence is to be past." So yeah, just if you're too focused on the worldly, on the earthly, on your finite existence, your existence as an existing finite individual, then it's folly, it's comic for Kierkegaard. So I'm just got a couple more things to give you here, and then I'm going to wrap up. He says that we start in the grip of immediacy, and we can't, or in the grip of our relative ends, our worldly desires, and we can't just jump to the absolute directly. Instead, we have to practice the absolute relation through the renunciation of relative ends. So there's a little bit of kind of a bit more concrete instruction we're getting here. How do we actually go about achieving the goal that Kierkegaard thinks we should all be aiming towards, our absolute telos, eternal happiness. And it starts with that renouncing relative ends. So not abandoning them, not completely trying to cut them off, but putting them in perspective, relating to them relatively, not absolutely. And this will remind you of what we talked about a couple of videos ago when we talked about subjectivity as untruth, and the way that this kind of cashed out for Kierkegaard is sin. So we all start in sin. We all start in this position of untruth, and we have to work our way through to subjectivity is truth. And we've got the same thing here. We can't just go straight to our absolute telos and be engaged in that task. We have to work our way towards it, because we always start in immediacy. We start focused on our relative ends. Those are the things that we value the most. We relate to them, Kierkegaard would say, absolutely. And I've got two more quotes which I'm going to stick together and give them both to you at the same time, because I think they summarize this position quite nicely. It's a nice way to finish up. The religious person has lost the relativity of immediacy. It's distraction, it's time wasting. Precisely, it's time wasting. The absolute consciousness of God consumes him like the scorching of the summer sun when it will not set. Through the decision in existence, the person existing has become in a more definitely determined way what he is. And so there Kierkegaard's just making the point, emphasizing that it's our absolute telos that is what should be important. It's that should be driving us rather than the relative telos. And remember that last quote there, through the decision in existence, the person existing has become in a more definitely determined way what he is. There's still the existing human being is still not, never becomes concrete, never becomes exactly what he is, can never get fully, completely to kind of complete being. And Kierkegaard is a little bit careful with that. He prefaces that last section with through the decision in existence. So we're still existing as a finite being. The person existing has become. So that becoming is still a key part there. And he's become in a more definitely determined way what he is. So still there's still the sense that the task is not finished, and it can never be finished, precisely because the individual is existing, is still becoming. As long as he or she is alive, they're still on that way, they're still becoming, although with this religious focus, with this keeping this idea of God in mind at all times, and the drive to the absolute telos, that the individual has become more definitely, more concrete than he or she was before. So hopefully that makes sense. I think we've done a lot of the groundwork now, and many of the things that I add here are just kind of adding to to the foundations that we've already discussed in prior videos. So anyway, let's have a quick look at a summary and see what we've talked about this video. So we started with faith, and we said that faith was an act of will, a passionate decision, but something that is never complete, a decision that we're always having to make anew. We never make it once and for all. And importantly, it was objectively uncertain, so we could never get that. So proof or evidence didn't hold any sway here. It was the opposite of doubt, and doubt and faith, both of those have nothing to do with knowledge. And that ties back to what I said at the beginning there. Faith is an act of will, not kind of a consequence of reasoning or a consequence of fact gathering. Then we looked at the relative telos, which we saw was willed for the sake of something else. And this was finite or worldly, or however you want to describe it, earthly desires, where but we ought not to kind of abandon this completely. Rather, the task is to relate relatively to the relative telos. So we're just kind of putting the relative ends in their place, or keeping them in perspective. And finally, we looked at the absolute telos, which was eternal happiness, and this was willed for its own sake. It was infinite, and the task here was to relate absolutely to it, to the absolute telos. And a key part of that was to have this in mind all of the time. So it had to be a continual kind of endeavor. And that is basically where I'm going to wrap up this video. Yeah, so thanks again for listening. I hope this is kind of adding to your understanding of Kierkegaard, or doing something anyway. If you have any questions or comments or anything that you think I've missed or you want to emphasize, stick them in the comment section. Otherwise, as always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.